Welcome to the Heiress and the Hussar, the story of the owners of the Friern Manor Farm Estate, East Dulwich, from 1796 to 1865. A story of Georgian social climbing and military valour, followed by Victorian civic duty and more military valour. I am Gavin Bowyer, a member of the Dulwich Society Local History Study Group. I'm a retired geologist and I've lived in the area about which I'm about to present since 1986. What do I mean by the Friern Manor Farm Estate? In 1961, H.J. Giles wrote a seminal book on the Victorian suburb, a study of the growth of Campbell. He divided Campbell into 30 principal estates and their subdivisions for building purposes, as shown on a plan at the back of his book. Number 17 was Friern Manor Farm Estate, the map shown on this slide. He defined it as running from in the north Peckham Rye Common down to Lordship Lane and then bounded on the south east by Wood Vale, a slightly more jagged boundary passing the Camberwell Old Cemetery back to Peckham Rye. But within this estate, Barry Road passes from Peckham Rye Common down to Lordship Lane, and the site of Friern Manor Farm is now where St Clement's Church is, which has one entrance on Barry Road, the other on Friern Road, named after Friern Manor Farm, close to where both these roads meet Underhill Road. I live in Creebor Street, which is more or less in the middle of this area, as shown. Now this solid red line is as Dias showed the estate, but in fact in the early half of the 1800s, pre-1860s, it extended beyond Wood Vale and covered part of what is now the Horniman Museum Gardens. When we moved into our current house in 1993, we also obtained the original deeds of the house. The house was built in 1880, and these deeds, first document, was a conveyance between British Land Company and the builders. But in the text of this conveyance document is a reference to a Lieutenant General William Cartwright and another from dated 20th October 1865 of the original sale by them to the British Land Company of the land. So who was he? Well, naturally I was curious and searched through the local history books and other sources and couldn't find him. Then, in the autumn of 2019, I found an abstract of this earlier sale document of 20th October 1865 in the archives of the Southwark Local History Library. It had been presented by Mrs. Beatrice Herring back in June 1967, and I'm very thankful to Mrs. Herring. What's more, the abstract was very comprehensive, some 71 pages, and it was a typed document so I did not have to wrestle with the handwriting which most documents were in originally of that period. It came from the archive of Russell and Davis solicitors had been in Coleman Street in East Central London. This firm of solicitors often represented the British Land Company at this time. This document, as I said, was very comprehensive, and it took the ownership back to the late 18th century, before the involvement of William Cartwright. It included detailed references to purchases of land by Henry Jones in 1773 and 1796. In March 1773, Henry had purchased some 110 acres of land occupied by Joseph Hill and others, and this land included Friern Court Farm, the name of Friern Manor Farm at the time. It came with all the outbuildings, orchards, gardens, and 10 fields of varying acreages. There is not a map of the fields at this time, but they all had names, and they were all referenced, their locations, to neighbouring fields, the fields of neighbouring landowners, or neighbouring roads. One of these fields was called Ladlands. This name carries on today as one of the major blocks of the flats at Dawson Heights, a landmark which can be seen from most of East Dulwich, included from my house. Some 23 years later, 1796, Henry acquired from Joseph Roos and Richard Turner a further 92 acres to the south of Friern Court Farm. This included the rather lovely named Nodlin's farmhouse on Lordship Lane and 19 fields. At the same time, he separately purchased a further 3 fields covering 18 acres. These were again to the south of the Nodlin's farm. So now, who was Henry Jones? And how was he able to afford to purchase a total of some 220 acres of farmland and buildings in the Dulwich-Peckham area? Well, I was a little bit concerned because Jones is not an uncommon name, and records in the 18th century are somewhat fragmentary. However, he does turn up, or a Henry, which I think is ours, in various lists of people in Camberwell for things such as jury service and land tax. In 1780, he turns up in a list of people qualified for jury service in Peckham, and this depended on a amount of land ownership. However, his address is not Friern Court Farm, but in Soho at 52 Frith Street. Shortly before he was going to buy his second purchase, we found him in the Camberwell land tax list for 1795. He appears below Joseph Roos, from whom he was about to buy Nodlin's farm, and his land is valued at that time of £150, which is quite a significant amount in 1795. So, knowing he had lived in Frith Street, Soho, I went there, but number 52 burnt down in 1803. However, at the top end of Frith Street, some Georgian buildings of the same era remain, notably Hazlitt's Hotel, shown here. Now, Frith Street is within the parish of St Anne's, Soho. Looking through the baptismal registry of St Anne's, in April 1745, a Henry Jones was born or baptized, the son of James and Mary Jones. This is very likely to be our Henry, but cannot be 100%. The Church of St Anne's still stands and is much as it was from the outside as in Henry's day. Further on in the baptismal record, we find a Henry Thomas Jones born in December 1777 with parents Henry Jones and Harriet. I think this is Henry Jones Sr., as I will now call him, son Henry Jones Jr., and with the mother named, we have a wife for Henry Jones Sr. Elsewhere in the records, one can find a marriage in 1770 between a Henry Jones and a Harriet Thomas. Possibly this is Henry Jones' marriage. He was obviously doing quite well because he was able to send his sons, Henry Jones Jr. and a second son, Inigo Jones, to Eton. And in the 1793 list of pupils at Eton in the upper school, we find our Henry Jones Major. Indigo would have been Jones Minor. And not only do we find him listed, but there are details of his further life. He went on to Trinity College, Cambridge, but sadly at the age of 27 he died, leaving an only daughter who married a Major General Cartwright. So we now have a link between Henry Jones Sr. and the Cartwright on my deeds. As an aside, on this same school list we have the Brummel brothers, Major and Minor, Brummel Minor being Beau Brummel. But there is no evidence that I have found that he and our Henry Jones Jr. had any sort of long-term friendship. The next information we have on Henry Jones Jr. is his marriage. In May 1801, and I'm sure it is him because he is listed as of Trinity College, Cambridge, and the marriage was to a Miss Thomas of Cobb Court in Sussex, and they married at St George's Church, Bloomsbury, a very fashionable church even to this day, just off Hanover Square. Sadly, a few months later, Henry Jones Sr. dies at Turnham Green, and it is reported after a few days' illness, and that he was Henry Jones of Bloomsbury Square, which again I think links him to our Henry Sr., because this seems to be very much the area they live in. His will showed that he had other landholdings, apart from Friern Court, Friern Manor, including land in Turnham Green, which might explain why he died there, and Oxfordshire, and was negotiating with the Duke of Bedford, probably his landlord, to buy land in Rotherhithe. Now, get some idea also from the will, which actually is both in the abstract of sale and can be found online in the original written form. He had sold a number of annuities, and these were shown as debts, and they possibly were the main source of his income. Now, the annuities had become a popular investment in the 18th century, where usually it required a few £1,000s, quite a significant sum, to buy one, and then the annuitant received interest on that of 4 to 5% or more until their death. But on their death, the annuity did not pass on to anybody else, but remained with the person who had sold it. For a while he had also had an address in New Inn, which is attached to the Middle Temple Inn of Court, and so it is likely that he practiced as an attorney, which could have formed another lucrative source of income. But despite his involvement with the law, he died with his final will not fully registered. But his sons Henry and Indigo agreed to carry out his wishes as he had intended, including finishing the purchase of the land in Rotherhithe. They then divided the land holdings between themselves, and substantial sums of money, up to £20,000 each, were inherited by their sisters, Harriet Mary and Anne Maria. Importantly, Henry Jones Sr. had made provision in his will for any sons of his son Henry, and importantly, if no sons, then for Henry Jr.'s daughter, or any daughter. And in fact, we can see the passage here highlighted, and if no sons, only one girl, immediately after my son's death, to make the estates chargeable with £20,000 and interest at 4% to pay said girl at 21. And a daughter was born in June 1802, Mary Ann Jones, daughter of Henry Thomas and Marianne, so she was named after her mother. And this is their entry from the Parish Register of St. Giles, Holborn. The church is still there, though now very overshadowed by Centre Point. Henry Jones Jr. seems to have taken a more direct interest in Friern Court Farm, and we find him here on an 1803 list of freeholders, Henry Jones Esquire, Friern Court Farm. This was not necessarily their main home, as in 1804 he can be found on an insurance policy with an address of 4 Gower Street, and that house is still there. But as we know from the Eton records, he died young. In fact, he died at Friern Court Farm, Peckham, Rye, and here it is in a couple of news items, death columns. At Friern Court Farm, Peckham, Rye, H.T. Jones Esquire of Gower Street, Bedford Square. And this is in September 1805. Now, not only does he die at Friern Court Farm, but he mentions it specifically in his will. He bequeaths the sale of implements and furniture of the farm, and the profits from any crops then growing, to his wife. But importantly, he does not seem to have bequeathed the farm to her, and this still seems to have remained, as per Henry Sr.'s will, as in trust for the daughter, our heiress. So, let us summarize where we are with the Jones family of Soho and Bloomsbury. We have Henry Jones Sr., born 1745, died 1801, possibly married 1770 to Harriet Thomas, and their children, Henry Jones Jr., born 1777, married 1801, and Marianne Thomas. He died 1805. She remarried but died 1812. And their daughter, our heiress, born 1802. Next of the Henry Jones Sr. children was Harriet Mary, born 1779. Then Indigo, born 1780. and Anne Maria, born 1781. But in 1812 we find our heiress Marianne Jones with no parents. But because she had a certain amount of wealth, she had been made a ward of Chancery under the protection of her elder aunt, Harriet Mary. At this point, I think we will leave her in the household of Harriet Mary and her husband Matthew Tierney, and I shall pick up the story of our Hussar, William Cartwright. The family tree for William Cartwright is far better established because he is a member of the Cartwright family of Ainhoe, Northamptonshire, a long established landholding family in that county. Richard Cartwright had purchased Ainhoe in 1616, and 5 or 6 generations later it was taken over by William's father, William Ralph Cartwright, who had become an MP, and his wife Emma Mary Maud, the daughter of Viscount Hawarden. William was in fact the second son. He had an older brother, Thomas. William himself was born in February 1797, but he wasn't baptised until the 1st of April 1797 at Bathwick St Mary in Somerset. This is within the Greater Bath area, and maybe his parents had waited until they joined the others of the social set at Bath for the season. Ainhoe House still stands, but it is no longer in the Cartwright family and is now luxury apartments. Like the Jones brothers, William and his older brother Thomas went to Eton, and here we find them on the 1805 list of pupils. William is in the first form, but his elder brother Thomas is in a class called Sense. As with Henry Jones Jr., we have a little bit of biographical detail. Thomas Cartwright eventually was knighted because of his services for the British government abroad. It lists one of his posts at British Minister at Stockholm, but he was also represented the British government in Belgium and for a time lived in Frankfurt, where he met and married his wife, the daughter of a German count. William Cartwright, Cartwright minor, also has some details. In fact, he became a general, where he lived, and one of his positions he held later in life. We will catch up with that in due course. But he did not stay to finish his education at Eton, because as the second son, he was destined for the army. His father had been a colonel in the local militia, but William was destined for the full-time army, and he was sent to the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. Sandhurst had become only fairly recently, a matter of few years before, a military college. There had been a military college for artillery officers for some time, but it was only more recently that it had decided that one was needed for officers in other areas of the army. In July 1812, he leaves Sandhurst and joins the Gloucester Regiment of Foot as an ensign. Within a year, he finds himself involved in the final battles of the Peninsular War. Wellington's army had managed to expel the French from Spain, but the French attempted in July 1813 to get back into Spain and invaded through various passes in the Pyrenees, and there followed some 7 or 8 days of fighting. Wellington's army repelled the French and pursued them into France. And the subsequent battles of Nivelles in November and Nimes in December 1813. In January 1814, William maybe had felt tired of being in the infantry, and we find he has a commission as a lieutenant in the 3rd Dragoons. And it is in the 3rd Dragoons he takes part in the next 2 battles. February 1814, the Battle of Orthez, and then in April, 10th April, the Battle of Toulouse. This last battle actually happened 4 days or so after Napoleon Bonaparte had surrendered to the Allied alliance of Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, Sweden, Portugal and Spain. But as we know from history, Napoleon did not stay away long. In February 1815, he escaped from exile on Isle of Elba in the Mediterranean, and the French army rallies to him, as do most of the citizens. And the French royal family flee once again, leaving Napoleon in command of France. In reply, the Allies assemble in the southern Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, in 2 armies, one multinational under the Duke of Wellington, and the other, mainly the Prussians, under Field Marshal Blücher. They prepare to invade France. But Napoleon moves first, intending to defeat the Prussians before they can join up with Wellington, and at the same time tie down Wellington's army, and he invades the Netherlands on 15th June 1815. William has moved on. He's now lieutenant in the 10th Prince of Wales Hussars, quite a fashionable regiment, but also a fighting force. Well, Napoleon moves against the Prussians at Ligny and sends another force to meet Wellington, who has mobilized from around Brussels, and they meet at the crossroads of Quatre Bras, and a battle ensues. The Hussars, including the 10th, have gone to Nivelles to protect Wellington's right flank. But as there is no fighting, they then move to the main battle at Quatre Bras. At that point, Wellington has decided he wants to make a strategic withdrawal to a site he has already chosen where he prefers to give battle, just south of the hamlet of Waterloo. The Hussars are part of the light cavalry force tasked with covering this withdrawal. The 10th are mentioned at the crossing of the river Genappe, where they give covering fire for the 7th Hussars to cross the river. The weather is very terrible on these days, lots of rain, and this hampers, I think, the French pursuit. So, on the 18th of June, we find the forces of Wellington's multinational army drawn up just south of Waterloo in front of the village of Mont-Saint-Jean, with his right flank protected by the farm buildings at Hougoumont, and the Hussars are on the left flank near the woods of La Haye, and the French are drawn up in front of La Belle Alliance. But although they were expecting an immediate attack, and the Allies, as had the French, had spent a miserable night in very wet and muddy conditions, the French did not actually attack until 11 o'clock in the morning, but they attacked several times, very fiercely, supported by artillery bombardments and cavalry. And despite a few attempts to silence the artillery, this carried on for much of the day. Then, in the late afternoon, early evening, the vanguard of the Prussians arrived on the battlefield, having shaken off the French army that had been sent to pursue them. At this moment was seized by Wellington to counterattack, and by now the Hussars had been moved into the centre of his formation and were quite prominent in the attack on the French forces, the Old Guard and some of the artillery. Accounts of the Battle of Waterloo are quite thorough because many of the combatants were literate. And our Lieutenant William Cartwright writes a letter home describing what happened to him in the battle to his father on 19th June, a day after, and a second letter a few days later to his mother in more detail. I shall just give you part, or the main part, of his letter to his father. My dear father, although I have seen many battles in my life, I assure you they were a complete farce to the one for this last 3 days. Boney, against us, fought like a tiger. We fought like Englishmen, and thanks to God, repelled him with great loss. Our cavalry behaved so finely that everyone, when they saw us, were quite thunderstruck. Poor Gunning was killed, as also Bouverie. I only wonder we were not all killed. I have lost all my baggage, and therefore intend taking Gunning's, and you will pay Mr. Gunning, I have no doubt. Thank God I have been lucky enough to escape. I commanded a troop on this occasion. We charged 4 or 5 times our numbers, the men in armour, but we made a pretty hole in them. There are not above 6 officers left with the regiment. I command a squadron now. We have been fighting since the 16th. I will give you another account in a day or two, but in the meantime, excuse this scrawl. We are within 3 leagues of Brussels. Poor Gunning was George Orlando Gunning of Horton Hall, Northamptonshire, similar age to William. Remember, at this time William was only 18. Bouverie, Everard Bouverie, was in fact in the household cavalry, and though wounded, he did survive. This letter, and a lot more details of the 10th Hussars in their involvement at Waterloo, can be found on the website 10thatwaterloo.co.uk. There is also a painting commissioned by the Prince of Wales, carried out by his personal artist, of the battle, painted in 1816. And as you might expect, the 10th Hussars, the 10th Prince of Wales Hussars, have a prominent position in the painting, and you can see their distinctive hats and sabres flashing in the thick of the fighting. The painting is in the National Trust collection at Place Neuilly, Anglesey, in the Cavalry Room. It is the home of the Marquess of Anglesey, who was Wellington's aide-de-camp at Waterloo. So now let us return to our heiress, Mary Ann Jones, and the story of how her aunt, particularly her elder aunt, bring her into high society. We left her as a ward of Chancery under the protection of that aunt, Harriet Mary Tierney. Remember, both aunts had inherited £20,000 from Henry Jones Sr., and they made good marriages. In 1808, Harriet had married Matthew Tierney, a doctor from relatively humble beginnings in Ireland who was practicing in Brighton. Tierney had met Dr. Edward Jenner, and he had graduated from Glasgow in 1802 and written an essay on cowpox. Yes, vaccinations. The Earl of Berkeley was his patron, and the Earl had introduced him to the Prince of Wales at a time when the Prince was, as often, a little bit unwell. Matthew also managed to help him, significantly so, that he appointed the physician to the Prince's household, and in October 1818 he was created Baron Tierney of Brighthelmstone. Not quite Baron of Brighton, but very close. So by 1818, Marianne was living in a household well connected to the social set surrounding the Prince Regent, who became George IV in 1820. In 1811, her other aunt, Anne Maria, had married Matthew's brother Edward Tierney, a solicitor. In part through Matthew's influence at court, Edward had been appointed Crown Solicitor for Ulster. But we are talking about a time when there is quite a stain on British society. The Tierney brothers and their wives were owners of slave plantations on St. Kitts in the West Indies. But there is no record of Marianne or her father being involved with slavery, according to the very thorough University College London database. So, how might Marianne and William have met? It is likely this would have been through various society events at Brighton, possibly in 1821. The Tierneys, Sir and Lady, often turn up on lists of people attending balls and other events. On the 22nd of February, they are shown as attending a splendid ball at the Pavilion, Brighton. And they are accompanied by Miss Jones, niece of Lady Tierney. So here we have Marianne attending a ball at the Pavilion, Brighton. Later that year, much later, 29th December, there is a grand ball at the Old Ship Rooms. In fact, that must be where the Old Ship Hotel now stands, opposite the surviving pier. Again, we find on the guest list the Tierneys, not this time Miss Jones, but several officers of the 10th Hussars are there as guests. So could William and Marianne have met each other or seen each other across a crowded ballroom in Brighton? However they met, in June 1822, William proposes to Mary, and he manages to get the approval of the Master of Chancery, she is still a ward of Chancery, and of her aunt Harriet, under whose protection she is. And on 6th of August 1822, they were married at St. George's, Hanover Square, where Marianne's parents had been married, as illustrated in this slide. Still a beautiful Georgian church, often referred to as Handel's church, as he was involved when it was constructed, especially in the installation of the organ, and he was a regular attendee at services there. And here we have copies of the marriage certificate, one the original handwritten and the other typed from the sales document. You will see that there are a lot of people listed on this certificate. Normally, a certificate might only have names of the groom, bride, who officiated, performed the ceremony, and the witnesses. But here you can see there are a number of Cartwrights and Baroness Tierney, and also, interestingly, a William LeBlanc. Now, Marianne was still not of age. She was still not quite 21. And she still had her inheritance in a form of trust. At her marriage, this trust was renewed and certain additional conditions put into it. And the first thing was that she was able to nominate her own trustees. In this case, initially they were John Beauclerk and the Earl of Normanton. And the trust had to ensure her an income of at least £1,000 per annum. And significantly, if William became bankrupt, then her estates were not forfeited and she retained them. But the estates could be used for the benefit of her children. Well, William and Marianne did not, like her father, live at Friern Court or Friern Manor Farm, or even stayed in the Bloomsbury area, but rather moved to Northamptonshire, initially at William's home of Ainio, and then set up home at Flor House, now spelled Flor, on the other side of the county, just outside Northampton. Flor House, when I last looked, was a boutique bed and breakfast. So, to summarize the family tree of William and Marianne, specifically from the point of view of William, here we have William's parents, William Ralph and Emma Mary Maud, and then we have William and Marianne Jones with their dates of birth, and as often happened, they fairly swiftly started a family with two sons, Fairfax William, born in 1823, and Aubrey Agar, born in 1825. Meanwhile, back at Friern Court Farm, Friern Court Manor Farm Estate, in April 1823, Friern Court and associated land, that is Friern Manor Farm Estate, was put under the control of William LeBlanc, a solicitor who we met earlier at the wedding. He mainly dealt in property. Unfortunately, this included slave plantations in the West Indies, as well as country estates in the United Kingdom. He was a long-standing friend and associate of the Jones family, and I found him on a document with Henry Jones Sr. in 1799. As I said, he was present at the wedding. He was a partner in Shaw, Blanc, Shaw. The first Shaw was Richard of Casino House, Dulwich, and the other Shaw, his brother Robert. Both brothers had died by 1823. More information on Richard Shaw of Casino House can be found through the Dulwich Society website. In the lease management agreement, the tenant of Friern Manor Farm, still called Friern Court at this time, was a Joseph Sturley, and of Nodlin's Farm, a Mr. Lewis. In December 1824, William LeBlanc died, and the lease passed to his son, William Elliot LeBlanc, also a solicitor, in September 1829, he handed the management of the land back to the trustees. The next major source of information is the tithe map of the parish of St Giles, Campbell, drawn up in 1838, which gives us details of the tenants, a plan and the extent of their farms and the tithe values. And here is the tithe map, or at least that part which covers our area of interest, the Friern Manor Farmer Estate, here outlined in red and shaded in light green. I have turned the map on its side, unlike the one shown at the beginning of this talk in part 1, for ease of viewing. On it you can see the course of Barry Road, Peckham Rye, Lordship Lane, Court Lane, Ladlands and Wood Vale. Wood Vale was called Wood Lane at this time. Also, we have yet another name for the farm. On the map it's named as Friern's rather than either Friern Court or Friern Manor. On this you can see the distribution between the tenants who were occupying the land at the time of the 1838 map. The major part, Friern Court Farm, Friern Manor Farm, was in the occupation or tenancy of a John Mee and a William Blackmore Noble. Nodlins in the tenancy of Daniel Lewis. I'm not sure if he is the same Lewis or a son of the Lewis mentioned in 1823, but I believe he is the same Lewis. Then, just on the top right-hand corner of the map, you can see George Hazeldine. He had those few extra fields which were largely on the other side of Wood Lane, Wood Vale. A bit more information on the tenants. John Mee and William Blackmore Noble, retired naval officers, married to sisters Esther and Elizabeth Allen. They had both served during the Napoleonic Wars, where they reached the rank of lieutenant. Their service included a period together on the same ship, HMS San Joseph, in 1810-1811. It had been a Spanish man of war captured by Nelson at Cape St. Vincent in 1797 and then became a Royal Navy vessel. Daniel Lewis is a farmer from a local family with other land holdings towards Peckham, and he was living towards Peckham at Prospect Place in 1841, and Prospect Place still exists and is easy to find because the name is in large letters across the top, where it is facing Peckham Rye. The other tenant was George Hazeldine. He was not a farmer, but owned a firm of coach builders in Lant Street, Southwark. Now you may or may not have noticed on the tithe map that there were some areas not shaded in green. This included a strip of 3 narrow fields in a sort of inverted U shape and another field on the edge of the green area. These 3 fields of some 13 acres and another 6 acres of the other field belonged to Sir Edward Bowyer, Smythe, the local hereditary landowner. In 1848, William bought them for £1,100. In 1849, he raised a loan of £700 against them. He discharged this loan in 18 1861. The next information we have on the occupancy of Friern Manor Farm Estate is from the 1851 census. By this time, John, me and William Noble had moved away, and Daniel Lewis had sadly died in 1844. George Heseltine, who was not shown in the 1841 census as living in the area, now had a house, Brown Lodge, on Wood Lane, Woodvale. Ben and George Wright brothers were the tenants of Friern Manor Farm, the main farm. In 1850, the farm is mentioned in London Milk, an article by Charles Dickens, in Household Words, and a couple of years later there is an article in the Illustrated London News in 1853. Friern Manor Farm was a dairy farm, and it supplied milk into the City of London and seemed to have quite a prominent name for itself. The other area of being farmed was by a Robert Fielding, but his farm is only recorded as 40 acres on east side of Lordship Lane, and so he has probably taken over Daniel Lewis's lease area, if not all of it, and the buildings at Nodlin's farm. For some relief from all these slides of writing and maps, here are a couple of pictures. These are watercolors taken after the sketches in the London Illustrated News of June 11th, 1853. They show the cows in the great meadow and the milking shed. The Illustrated London News artist took a few liberties with the pictures, especially in depicting milkmaids, as all the milking at the farm at that time was done by men, and neither was there any milking done in the fields, but it was all in the milking shed. Also, he included a family in the milking shed. It would seem that Friern Manor Dairy Farm was considered a model dairy farm, and so suitable for family visits by Victorian families to show the children where their milk came from. It's still important today for children to know where not only their milk, but their food comes from. Here is an advert for Friern Manor Dairy Farm. The original is in the archives of the London Metropolitan Archive collection. You will note it stresses pure country milk and depicts quite a rural idyll as where the milk is coming from. Also, the farm is sited at Peckham Rye, as still East Dulwich concept is not with us. Also here is an extract from Charles Dickens' article, London Milk, of 1850. In his article, he describes at great length the landscape around the farm, the care of the animals, and it is obvious that he was very impressed. But here I've just thought it of more interest to concentrate on how they arrange their deliveries and quality. The milking took place either side of midnight, with the milk being passed through several strainers, and then for security in great tin cans or churns, which were barred across the top and sealed. They are taken to the dairy office in Farringdon Street in the early hours, where they are redistributed amongst smaller churns, and the milkmen, each wearing the badge of the Friern Manor Farm Dairy. Marketing obviously is quite important. They were delivered in 2 deliveries. An early round for those who took an early breakfast, and a later delivery for those more leisurely people who had a late breakfast.
So, back to the Cartwright family. As I said earlier, they were living in Northamptonshire at Fleur. But the trust agreement for their mother for Friern Manor Farm included that it could be used for the benefit of her children. And this happened. The sons Fairfax and Aubrey raised loans using the land holdings as security. In the early 1850s, Fairfax, the elder brother, raised some £21,000 at 4 to 5% interest. In today's money, that would be 1.5 million. And his younger brother Aubrey, with Fairfax acting as guarantor, raised some £1,350, about £100,000 in today's money. It's always difficult to take historic values and put them into today's money. But I decided to use a website called moneysorter.co.uk. Other factors could be used to arrive at different modern day equivalents.
So, why did Fairfax need to raise money? In 1840s, early 1840s, he had gone up to Oxford, and in 1844 he got his BA from Christ Church College. He then went on to become a Fellow of All Souls College from 1845 to 1850. But maybe he found academic life a little bit boring, and hearing some of the adventures of his father, he decided to follow a military career. But also, perhaps reflecting his family's European connections through his uncle Thomas, he joined the Austrian army. And from 1848 to 1855, he was a captain in the Archduke Charles Lancers of that army. It is likely that to maintain the lifestyle of an army officer in the Austrian army, he used some of the proceeds of those loans. But he heard the patriotic call, and when England was involved in the Crimean War, he returned, and with his knowledge of German, he was made a major in the British German Legion serving in Crimea, after which he returned to civilian life. The younger son, Aubrey, it would seem, did not pursue the academic route, but possibly joined directly the military. And certainly we find him in the Rifle Brigade, serving in South Africa in 1848, where he was at the Battle of Boomplatz between the British and the Boers, not far from modern-day Kimberley. The Boers lost the battle, but seemingly won the peace, as the treaty gave them a lot more control up until the Boer Wars towards the end of the 19th century. But there was fighting elsewhere, and the Rifles were sent to the Crimea, where on the 5th November 1854, at the Battle of Inkerman, leading his troops, young Aubrey was shot and killed. I do not know if his body was returned to England, but certainly in the church at Ainho, alongside the family home of Ainho House, we find a marble plaque commemorating young Aubrey Agar Cartwright. It lists his battle honours and also emphasises his military career with a rifle and sword carved at the top of his plaque. So, what of the career of William Cartwright after Waterloo? Well, we know that he stayed in the Hussars for some 10th Hussars for some time, becoming a captain in 1821, the rank he held at his wedding. In 1825 he was a major, but became then a major unattached and was in the reserves. In the reserves he gradually rose up the ranks. In 1851 he was made a lieutenant colonel, unattached, half pay. 1857 major general, and in 1863 lieutenant general, the rank he held when he was made the land sale and appeared on my deeds. But he also had a civilian life, and as a member of a prominent county family, he was expected to serve on various civil bodies. From 1833 he was chairman of Brackley Board of Guardians. They were mainly responsible for the workhouse and hospital. From 1846 he had a county role as Deputy Lieutenant of Northamptonshire, and from 1851 Chairman of Northamptonshire Quarter Sessions, a magistrate role. But his most prominent civilian work was in 1856 he was appointed the first of Her Majesty's Inspectors of Constabulary, responsible for forces in the Midlands, a position which he held until 1869. The county constabularies and those of some of the small county towns were not very well organised at that time, unlike, say, in the big cities. They were often used by the local authorities as sort of general dogs' bodies, as a workforce for when various things needed to be done or taxes collected. But there was a need for a force dedicated to dealing with crime. And William, with his military background, did quite a lot of work in organising the county forces along more rigid lines and with suitable pay, and he was always trying to help them with things like superannuation. He was definitely the senior of the 3 inspectors that were appointed at this time, and in the history of Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, the first 150 years, published in 2006, there is quite a lot of words dedicated to his role. But what of his wife, Marianne, our heiress? She does not seem to have been so prominent in public life, but she did take an interest in local affairs. In 1851, Flor was wanting to get established a girls' school, and William had written to Christ Church, Oxford, who were parsons of the living of Flor, asking for finance to establish such a school, but they turned it down. Some money had already been subscribed, so Mrs. Cartwright, Marianne, stepped in to pay the remaining cost of the school and also for the salary of the mistress. School was quite small, just a classroom for girls and another room with a terraced floor for infants. But it was a start and showed her the importance that girls should also be educated. Marianne died in 1860 and is buried at the family church at Ainio, and she also has a marble plaque. The next information we have on the tenants of the Friern Manor Farm estate is the census of 1861. George Wright is living at Friern Manor Farm with Anne, his wife, but George and Benjamin had dissolved their partnership in November 1851. However, Benjamin's name might still be on the lease. George Heseltine has moved from the area to Godstone in Surrey. He died a year later in 1862, but his coach building business continued in Land Street. A large part of Nodlin's farm has been taken over by the Crystal Palace and Suburban Brick and Tile Company. It is being run by the Dawson brickmaking family from Plumstead. 19-year-old Ebenezer Dawson is described as a brick manufacturer, and he is living with his older sister at a house on Lordship Lane by the entrance to the brickworks. And yes, this is where the name Dawson comes from, for Dawson's Heights. The large block of flats sit prominently on a hill overlooking a lot of East Dulwich. In 1863, there were developments on the southern end of the estate. The London-Dover-Chatham Railway were in the process of building a branch line from Honor Oak to Crystal Palace. This was to serve the increasing number of visitors to Crystal Palace. And by August 1863, at the second half-yearly meeting of the company, it was reported that their contractors had possession of all land for the line from the junction of Wood Lane, Wood Vale, and Forest Hill Road to Crystal Palace. This cut off the southern fields of the estate, which area is now part of the Horniman Museum Gardens. And the line itself was opened a couple of years later on 1st August 1865. Few months before the land sale. And here is a detail from the 1870 map of Dulwich village showing the railway line where it crosses Lordship Lane. And as you could see by then, there had already been some housing development either side of the lane, either side of the railway, near the Lordship Lane railway station. Finally, we come to the sale of the estate to the British Land Company in 1865. But before the sale took place, on 18th October, William and his son Fairfax settled the loans against the estate, which with interest had risen to over £40,000. 2 days later, 20th October 1865, they sold 206 acres of the Friern Manor Farm estate for £64,200 to Richard Heiress, a director of and the agent for the British Land Company, and also a director of the National Freehold Land Society, which had been formed in 1849 by two Liberal MPs to increase the number of eligible voters, eligibility requiring being a freeholder, by increasing the number of freeholders. Then in the 1850s they realised they needed to separate out the commercial arm of this initiative, and the British Land Company was formed. But even then, within a few years, some other reforms to voter eligibility lessened its role, and the British Land Company had become more of a land development company. The value of the sale in today's money would be some £5.6 million. The sale document includes a map which shows the extent of the land being sold and also the status of various leases existing on the land. As you can see, the major part is that under lease to Benjamin Wright, which is the Friern Manor Farm, some 106.5 acres, but it had only about less than a year, well, a couple of years to run to September 1867. Also, you can see the extent of the Crystal Palace Suburban Brick and Tile Company lease, but this had until 1878 to run. And there was a small amount of land to the north, which was mainly housing by now. And then there was quite a lot of land shown as unlet. And interestingly, the land bought in 1848 is still differentiated as pink. But the Cartwrights had retained a certain amount of land, that where houses were being built next to Lordship Lane Station. On 5th June 1873, William died at his London home, 16 Green Street off Grosvenor Square. He was buried in his family tomb at Ainhoe Church Cemetery, and he also has a marble memorial plaque in the church alongside those of his wife and sons. And here it is, and you'll see that it has his cavalry sword across the top and lists his battle honours. The funeral service was well attended, including by his son and other senior Cartwrights. The service at the graveside was taken by the Reverend Sir Henry John Gunning. He was the brother of George Orlando Gunning, who we met, having died at William's side at Waterloo. William is buried in his family tomb, an imposing tomb, again with a sword carved on its top and with his battle honours listed either side of details of his life. Well, finally a portrait of William Cartwright, probably about 1850. This is in the collection of the Northamptonshire Archives. The Northamptonshire Archives hold the whole Cartwright archive, some 52 boxes, but only one of which is of William's Cartwright, and a lot of that contains letters, many of which were between him and Marianne in the lead up to their marriage. So now I would like to think that Lieutenant General William Cartwright is more than a name on a deed, and that his place in the history of East Dulwich, along with that of his wife Mary and her grandfather and father, both Henry Sr. and Henry Jr. Jones, are rediscovered. So, my thanks to you for listening, and to the following who provided support and sources of information, and a list of some of the websites that I found useful in my research. Thank you.